Late September on Lake Caraway has a particular kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that only shows up after the tourist boats are gone and the summer crowds drift back toward cities. The water that morning looked like dark glass, perfectly still, except for the small ripples coming off a pair of ducks moving through the reeds. I was standing on the end of my dock with a coffee mug in one hand and a wrench in the other, tightening the last bracket on a new cleat. The air smelled like wet cedar and fallen leaves. 40 yards up the shoreline, my old John boat rocked gently against the pilings. It was shaping up to be a good day. Then gravel crunched behind me, not the slow, casual crunch of a neighbor pulling in to say hello. This was sharper, faster, official. I turned and saw the convoy coming down my dirt drive. First the White County SUV, then the black Tahoe with the gold Lake Ridge HOA decal across the door. And right behind it, because of course, was Marlene Keaton, president of the Lake Ridge Homeowners Association, arms crossed, jaw tight, wearing sunglasses large enough to block out the sun and most of her peripheral vision. She stepped out of the Tahoe, like someone arriving at a crime scene, which, apparently, she believed this was. She pointed straight at my dock. "That structure is in violation of the Lake Ridge Shoreline Access Covenant," she announced. The county inspector beside her shifted awkwardly. Marlene continued, "You have 72 hours to remove it." I took a sip of coffee, looked at the dock, looked back at her. Then I said the sentence that made the inspector blink and made Marlene's mouth slowly open. "You might want to check your own drainage system before you start issuing orders." She frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" I set my coffee down on the railing, because this was the moment everything started to fall apart for her. "You remember that storm last spring?" I asked. "The one that flooded my lower pasture?" She gave a tight smile. "That's not our problem." I nodded slowly. Then I said, "Funny thing about water, Marlene. It usually runs downhill." I pointed toward the slope behind her house. "And the new drainage pipe your HOA installed?" I paused. "It empties directly onto my property." The inspector looked between us. Marlene scoffed. "That's impossible," I shrugged. "Well," I said, "it might seem that way now, but when the next big storm comes," I let the sentence hang there, because by then I already knew exactly what was going to happen and what would happen when it did. But before any of that makes sense, you need to understand three things. First, who I am. Second, how Lake Ridge got built next to my land. And third, how Marlene Keaton managed to start a war with the one neighbor she absolutely should have left alone. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 56 years old, retired civil engineer. For 29 years I designed municipal drainage systems across North Carolina and Virginia, stormwater retention basins, flood mitigation channels, subdivision grading plans. If water moved across land in those counties, chances are someone in my office had drawn the maps for it. Water and land use are things you learn to understand on a very deep level when you do that job long enough. You start seeing patterns most people miss. Slopes, soil types, watershed lines where water wants to go and where people foolishly try to force it somewhere else. My property sits on 23 acres along the western shore of Lake Caraway. My grandfather bought it in 1964, back when the lake was mostly farmland and two-lane roads. The house itself is nothing special. A cedar-sided cabin he built himself, stone fireplace, tin roof, wide porch facing the water. But the land? That's the important part. The land slopes gradually down from a ridge to the lake, which means all the rainfall from the hills above naturally drains through the lower meadow behind my house before reaching the shoreline. It's always been that way. The drainage patterns were recorded in the original county plats. They're still recorded that way today. I know because I've studied those plats more times than I can count. For 50 years, the only neighbors we had were farms. Then, in 2016, a development company bought the ridge property behind mine, 200 acres of former timberland, and they built Lake Ridge Estates, 72 houses, all large, all expensive, all part of a very enthusiastic homeowners association. Now, to be fair, the first HOA president wasn't a problem, a retired dentist named Carl Morrison. Carl understood something important. My land existed long before the subdivision. The lake frontage on my side of the property was private, and the drainage path across the meadow had been there since the county surveyors mapped the watershed in the 1950s. Carl and I got along fine. We shook hands, agreed to stay out of each other's business, and for 3 peaceful years that's exactly what happened. Then, Carl moved to Florida, and Marlene Keaton decided she wanted to run the HOA. Marlene was 62, former regional sales manager for a chain of luxury furniture stores. If you've ever met someone who spent 30 years selling expensive things to wealthy people, you know the type. Perfect posture, very confident, tone, and a deep belief that if something exists near her house, she probably gets a vote in how it's used. She ran for HOA president unopposed, which usually tells you one of 2 things: either nobody cares or nobody wants the headache. Within 6 months of taking the job, Marlene had issued violation notices for wind chimes, mailbox colors, garden gnome height restrictions. I'm not joking about that last one. One resident received a formal citation because the HOA bylaws apparently allowed decorative statues up to 24 inches tall. His garden gnome was 26. Another homeowner got fined because his boat trailer was visible from the street for 3 days. 3 days. That sort of thing didn't affect me. My property isn't part of the Lake Ridge HOA. Never has been. My land is a separate parcel with its own deed history, dating back decades before the subdivision existed. So when Marlene first started complaining about my dock, I honestly didn't take her seriously. The dock had been there for 15 years. It sits well within my shoreline boundary, and under North Carolina lake access law, the deeded waterfront owner has the right to maintain a private dock extending to the navigable channel. That right is recorded in my deed, but Marlene saw things differently because the Lake Ridge residents used a community path that ended near the shoreline 2 lots north of my property. In her mind, that meant the lake itself should be treated as shared access. And my dock? Apparently, it was an obstacle. The first complaint arrived by certified mail, a formal notice from the HOA's attorney, Dere, stated that my dock interfered with the visual and recreational enjoyment of the community shoreline. I read the letter twice, then I called the attorney. He sounded tired. The kind of tired lawyers get when they're handling a case they already know is nonsense. "Mr. Harper," he said carefully, "your property is not within the HOA jurisdiction." "No," I said, "I assume you know that too." Pause. "Yes." "Then why did you send the letter?" Another pause. "I was instructed to." That was the beginning. What came next was 18 months of complaints, code enforcement inspections, environmental inquiries, noise complaints about my boat motor, a zoning inquiry regarding whether my dock could be considered a commercial structure. Each time the county reviewed the complaint, each time the inspector concluded the same thing: everything on my property was legal. But Marlene wasn't really trying to win those disputes. She was building something else, a record, because people, like Marlene, understand paperwork as a weapon. If you file enough complaints against someone, eventually it starts to look like there must be a problem, even when there isn't. And for a while, that strategy worked, until the spring storm and the drainage pipe, and the moment Marlene Keaton accidentally redirected half the ridge's stormwater onto the one property owned by a retired drainage engineer. But that part didn't become obvious right away. In fact, the first sign something had gone very wrong came during a storm that hit Lake Caraway one night in April, and it changed everything. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday night in April. If you've lived near a lake long enough, you learn to recognize the kind of storm that isn't just rain. The air shifts first. The wind picks up from the south. The clouds roll in low and heavy, like someone dragging a gray blanket across the sky. By 6 in the evening, the pressure had dropped enough that my ears popped while I was walking the property line. By 8, the first thunder started, deep, slow, rolling across the water. I secured the boat, closed the barn doors, and checked the drainage ditch along the upper meadow, the way I always do when a heavy storm is coming. That ditch had been there longer than I had. My grandfather dug the first version with a tractor in the late 60s to guide stormwater toward the creek that feeds the lake. For 50 years it had handled every storm the mountains could throw at it. At least, it had until that April night. The rain started around 9. At first it was steady and quiet. Then it got heavier. Then the kind of rain that sounds like handfuls of gravel hitting the roof. By 10:30, the downpour had turned the entire hillside into a sheet of moving water. Sat at the kitchen table watching it through the back window, listening to the gutter overflow. Stormwater runoff isn't random. It follows patterns shaped by gravity and terrain, and after 30 years designing those patterns, I can usually predict exactly where the water will move. That night something felt wrong. The ditch should have been carrying most of the runoff down toward the creek. Instead, the water was spreading, pooling, moving sideways across the pasture. I grabbed a flashlight and pulled on my rain jacket. When I stepped outside, the wind nearly took the door out of my hand. The rain was coming down so hard, the flashlight beam barely reached 20 feet. But even in that chaos, I could hear something over the storm, running water, a lot of it, not trickling, not flowing, pouring. The sound was coming from the far side of the pasture, up near the property line where the Lake Ridge development sits on the ridge above me. I sloshed through ankle-deep mud until I reached the fence line. Then I saw it. 4-foot-wide stream of brown water blasting out of a plastic drainage pipe. The pipe itself stuck out from the hillside like a cannon barrel, and it was pointed directly into my pasture. The flow was enormous, hundreds of gallons per minute. It wasn't natural runoff. It was concentrated discharge, stormwater collected somewhere above and redirected into that pipe. And I knew exactly what that meant. Somewhere uphill, Lake Ridge Estates had installed a stormwater drainage system instead of dispersing water across multiple retention areas the way most responsible developers do. Someone had decided to funnel it into one outlet. That outlet happened to empty directly onto my land. Within minutes, I watched the meadow begin to flood. Water spread across the grass and began moving downhill toward the barn. I checked my watch. 47 p.m. By midnight, the lower pasture looked like a shallow lake, and the drainage ditch my grandfather dug 50 years earlier, it couldn't handle that kind of concentrated flow, not even close. The storm finally passed around 2 in the morning. When the clouds cleared, the moon reflected off several inches of standing water across half the pasture. Fences leaned where the current had pushed against them. The ground near the drainage pipe had been gouged into a muddy trench. I stood there in the quiet after the storm, boots sinking into wet soil, staring at that pipe sticking out of the hill. And I realized something. This wasn't an accident. Stormwater systems don't appear overnight. They require permits, engineering drawings, county approval. Someone had designed that pipe. Someone had approved it, and someone had installed it without ever mentioning that it would dump its entire output directly onto my property. I turned off the flashlight and I smiled, because if there's one thing civil engineers understand better than almost anything else, it's liability. The morning after at 7, the next morning I called the county planning office. A woman named Laura Briggs answered. Laura had been reviewing development permits in the county for nearly 15 years. Which means she had probably seen every variety of bad construction decision imaginable. "Laura," I said, "did Lake Ridge Estates install a stormwater outlet along the southern ridge?" There was a pause while she pulled up the records. Then she said something interesting. "They installed a retention basin system 2 years ago?" "A basin system?" "Yes, 3 basins designed to slow runoff before discharge. That's when I knew something was wrong, because the water blasting out of that pipe the night before was not slowed runoff. It was concentrated discharge, which meant one of 2 things had happened. Either the system had been built incorrectly, or someone had modified it after inspection. "Where is the official outlet location?" I asked. Another pause. Then Laura said, "According to the approved plans, the outlet should drain toward the county easement on the east side." "East side, not my pasture. Would you mind emailing me those drawings?" I asked. She did. 20 minutes later, the plans arrived in my inbox. I printed them, spread them across the kitchen table, and studied them carefully. The approved system included 3 retention basins connected by overflow channels. Those basins were designed to slow the water before releasing it into a natural drainage corridor that ran toward the county road. Not toward my property, but the pipe I saw the night before. That pipe bypassed the entire system. It ran straight from the top basin down the slope toward my land, which meant somebody had installed an unauthorized outlet, and if that outlet wasn't in the approved plans, the county definitely hadn't signed off on it, which meant someone had created a stormwater discharge that violated state environmental regulations. That's a serious problem, a very expensive problem, and suddenly Marlene Keaton's campaign against my dock looked a lot less important, because the real issue wasn't the dock, it was the pipe. But here's the thing about situations like this. You don't rush, you document, you gather information, you make absolutely sure you understand the entire picture before anyone realizes what you know. So that morning I did 3 things. First, I walked the entire fence line and photographed the drainage pipe from every angle. Second, I measured the erosion trench the water had carved into the pasture. And third, I climbed the ridge. The Lake Ridge subdivision sits about 60 feet higher than my property. At the top of the hill, the ground flattens out into a row of expensive houses overlooking the lake. Perfect views, landscaped yards, neatly trimmed hedges, and, tucked behind those houses, exactly where the plan showed it, sat the first stormwater retention basin, except it wasn't functioning as designed. The basin had an overflow channel, but the channel had been blocked with gravel and landscaping stones, which meant, during heavy rain, the basin couldn't release water gradually. Instead, the water filled up until it reached the top, where someone had installed that bypass pipe. A pipe that carried the overflow straight down the hill, straight onto my land. Crouched beside the basin and studied the pipe connection, fresh PVC joints, new brackets. This wasn't original construction. Someone had added that pipe later, probably after homeowners started complaining about standing water near their yards, which meant whoever authorized the change had solved their drainage problem by transferring it directly onto my property. And as I stood there examining the pipe, I heard a voice behind me. "Can I help you?" I turned. Marlene Keaton stood on the walking path about 20 feet away, arms crossed, expression cold. I stood up slowly. "Morning, Marlene." Her eyes flicked toward the basin. "What are you doing here?" I brushed dirt off my hands. "Just looking at your stormwater system." Her posture stiffened. "This is HOA property." "Technically," I said calmly, "it's part of a permitted drainage structure subject to county regulation." That made her pause. "You're trespassing." I smiled. "Actually, I'm inspecting the source of water that flooded my land last night," she scoffed. "Rain floods land. That's how nature works." "True," I said. "But engineered drainage systems change how nature works." I pointed toward the pipe. "That outlet isn't in your county-approved plans." Her face changed, just slightly, but enough. "Those plans are none of your business." "Normally I'd agree," I said. "But when your drainage pipe empties onto my property, it becomes very much my business." She stepped closer. "You're imagining things." I pulled out my phone, opened the photo of the pipe blasting water during the storm. Then I showed her the approved drainage plan. Her eyes flicked between the two, and for the first time since I'd met her, Marlene Keaton looked uncertain, just for a second. Then the arrogance came back. "You have no authority here." I nodded. "You're right." I turned toward the path. "But the county does." And that's when the situation started moving toward the moment Marlene never saw coming, because once the county inspectors got involved, the problem with that pipe was about to become impossible for the HOA to ignore. And even then, none of us yet realized where all that water would eventually end up, or whose house sat directly downhill from the second drainage basin. By the time I got back down the ridge that morning, the sun had burned through the last of the storm clouds. The lake looked calm again, almost innocent. If you didn't know better, you'd never guess that 12 hours earlier, a small river had been blasting through my pasture. But the evidence was still there. Mud-erosion, fence posts leaning sideways, and that drainage pipe sticking out of the hillside like a smoking gun. I didn't call the county immediately. That might sound strange. But when you've spent decades dealing with land development disputes, you learn something important. The first person to complain often gets treated like the problem. So instead of rushing, I spent the next 2 days documenting everything. Measured the depth of the erosion trench, took drone photos showing the water path from the pipe to the creek, marked the high water line across the pasture with survey flags. Then, I compared those photos with the drainage plans Laura had emailed. Me, they didn't match, not even close. The approved plans clearly showed 3 retention basins feeding into a natural drainage corridor on the east side of the subdivision, the pipe. Dumping into my pasture bypassed that entire system, which meant someone had modified the design without approval, and that's where things start getting expensive. Because unauthorized stormwater discharge isn't just a civil issue, it's a regulatory one, the kind that brings in environmental inspectors, and those inspectors tend to ask very uncomfortable questions. By Thursday afternoon, I had everything organized in a folder: photos, measurements, engineering notes, copies of the original drainage permit. Then I drove into town and stopped at the county planning office. Laura Briggs recognized me immediately. "How bad is it?" she asked. I set the folder on her desk. "Bad enough that you'll probably want to see it in person." She opened the folder and began flipping through the photos. The erosion trench, the pipe outlet, the drone shots showing the water path across. My land. Halfway through the stack she stopped. "That pipe isn't in the approved plans?" "Exactly." She leaned back in her chair. "Did the storm cause flooding?" "About 6 inches of standing water across 3 acres. She nodded slowly. Then she picked up the phone. "Let me call the environmental compliance officer." The inspection happened the next morning. 3 vehicles rolled into my driveway just after 9. Laura from the planning office, a county environmental engineer named Victor Salazar, and a stormwater compliance officer from the state Department of Environmental Quality. Victor walked the pasture first. He crouched beside the erosion trench, measuring the depth with a metal ruler. Then he followed the path of the water up the slope toward the pipe. The DEQ officer took photos. Lots of photos. When we reached the pipe outlet, Victor studied the PVC connection for a long time. Finally, he said the words I had been expecting. "This isn't part of the permitted system." The DEQ officer nodded. "Looks like a bypass installation." Victor turned toward the ridge where the Lake Ridge home sat. "Let's go see the basin." We climbed the hill together, and as soon as we reached the top, the problem became even clearer. The first retention basin was nearly full, but instead of draining slowly through the approved overflow channel, the water level was high enough to reach the bypass pipe, which meant every heavy rain would send a concentrated surge down the hill. Victor walked the perimeter of the basin. Then he pointed at the gravel blocking the overflow channel. "Who did?" "This?" I shrugged. "You'd have to ask the HOA." The DEQ officer took more photos, blocking an approved drainage channel and installing an unauthorized discharge pipe, she said quietly. Victor whistled. "That's going to require a correction." "Order." Which, in plain English, means the county would force the HOA to restore the drainage system to its approved design, and depending on the damage caused downstream, they could also face fines. But the story didn't end there, because while Victor was examining the basin, a familiar voice drifted across the path. "What exactly is going on here?" Marlene Keaton, she walked toward us with the determined stride of someone who believed she was about to take control of a situation. Then she saw the DEQ officer, and the camera, and the clipboard. Victor introduced himself. "Marlene Keaton?" "Yes. I'm Victor Salazar with the County Engineering Department. We're reviewing a stormwater discharge issue." Her eyes flicked toward me. Then back to Victor. "Our drainage system is fully compliant." Victor gestured toward the blocked channel. "Do you know who installed that pipe?" "That pipe has always been there." Victor shook his head. "No, it hasn't." He held up the drainage plans. "The permitted system discharges east, not south." Marlene's expression tightened. "Well, clearly something has been misinterpreted." The DEQ officer stepped forward. Ma'am, stormwater systems cannot be modified without county approval. The HOA board authorized improvements to prevent flooding. Did you file a permit? Silence. Victor looked at the pipe again. Then, back at Marlene. This outlet directs runoff onto Mr. Harper's property. That's downhill, she said defensively. Water flows downhill. Victor nodded. Yes. Then he said something that made the entire situation suddenly much worse for you. Because Victor had just noticed something. He pointed toward the second retention basin, the one located about 40 yards farther along the ridge. That basin feeds into the first one, which meant if the system overflowed, water would back up, and when water backs up in a drainage system, it doesn't just disappear. It finds the next lowest point. Victor looked across the ridge, then at Marlene. Which house is yours? She pointed toward a large stone home at the end of the street. Victor. Check the slope of the land. Then he glanced at me and smiled slightly. Interesting. The second storm. The county issued the HOA a formal notice that afternoon. The letter required them to remove the unauthorized pipe and restore the drainage system to its permitted configuration. But that process takes time. Contractors have to be hired. Permits reviewed. Work scheduled in the meantime? Nah. The pipe stayed exactly where it was, which meant the next big storm would behave exactly like the last one. And, sure enough, the next storm arrived 2 weeks later. Another spring system rolling down from the mountains. Heavy rain, strong wind, lots of runoff. I stood on my porch watching the clouds build over the lake, and I knew exactly what was about to happen because the first basin would fill, then the second basin would feed into it, and when both basins overflowed, the water would take the path of least resistance down the pipe across my pasture. But there was one small difference this time. Victor had ordered the blocked overflow channel cleared, which meant the water now had two directions it could go. One path down the pipe, the other back across the ridge, toward the lowest house in the development, Marlene's house. And when the rain finally started that evening, it didn't take long. The basins filled quickly. The pipe roared like a fire hose. Water surged down the hill into my pasture. But as the level continued rising, the basin began spilling backward too, across the ridge, across the HOA walking path, and toward the one property sitting directly downhill, Marlene Keaton's. At 11:12 p.m., my phone rang. It was Victor. You might want to turn on the local news. I did. The camera showed emergency lights flashing in Lake Ridge Estates. Firefighters were pumping water out of a basement window and standing in the driveway, soaking wet and shouting at someone off camera. Was Marlene Keaton. Her basement had filled with 3 feet of stormwater because the drainage system she modified had finally done exactly what gravity demanded. It sent the water back where it belonged, and that was the moment the entire HOA finally understood something Marlene never had. When you start a war over land, you'd better make sure you understand how that land actually works. The morning after the second storm, Lake Ridge Estates looked like a construction zone. Mud tracked across the sidewalks, sandbags stacked around a handful of homes along the lower ridge, 2 industrial fans humming in the open basement windows of Marlene Keaton's house. When I drove past on my way into town, a restoration truck sat in her driveway with hoses running through the front door. Stormwater had filled the entire lower level of her house. Carpet ruined, drywall soaked, furniture stacked outside under tarps. It was the kind of damage that takes weeks to repair, and while I'm not the sort of person who enjoys someone else's misfortune, I did recognize the irony. The drainage system she'd modified to push water away from the neighborhood had finally sent it straight back to her. Because gravity doesn't care about HOA bylaws, gravity just follows the land. By noon that day, the county issued a second notice to the Lake Ridge HOA. This one was much less polite than the first. Victor Salazar emailed me a copy. The subject line read, Emergency Compliance Order. The county required the HOA to remove the unauthorized drainage pipe immediately, restore the retention basin overflow channel, repair erosion damage to my pasture, hire a licensed engineer to redesign the entire stormwater system failure. To comply would result in fines beginning at $5,000 per day. That got everyone's attention, especially the homeowners who had suddenly realized their HOA board had created a drainage disaster, which is why 3 days later, the Lake Ridge Clubhouse hosted the most crowded HOA meeting the neighborhood had ever seen. The meeting the clubhouse sat near the entrance to the subdivision, a large brick building with tall windows overlooking the lake. Normally, those meetings drew maybe 10 residents. That night, there were more than 60 people packed into the room, some standing along the walls, others sitting on folding chairs brought in from the storage closet. I didn't actually live in the subdivision, but Wendell Carter, one of the Lake Ridge homeowners who'd been quietly following the situation, invited me as his guest. "People want to hear what actually happened," he said. When we walked inside, the room fell silent. Marlene Keaton stood at the front table with 2 other HOA board members. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. Her usually perfect hair pulled back into a loose knot, but the posture was still there. Straight spine, arms crossed, the posture of someone who still believed she could control the narrative. The meeting opened with routine formalities, minutes from the previous session, financial report. Then Wendell raised his hand. "I move that we address the stormwater issue." Murmurs filled the room, the board member sitting beside. Marlene nodded reluctantly. "Fine," Marlene said. "We'll discuss it." She stood and began exactly the way I expected. With the recent storms, some properties experienced unexpected flooding. Unexpected. I almost laughed. She continued, "We are working with the county to resolve drainage concerns." That's when someone near the back interrupted. "My basement flooded." Another voice followed. "Mine too." Then another. "Why was that pipe installed in the first place?" The room grew louder. Questions stacked on top of questions. Finally, Marlene raised her voice. "That pipe was installed to protect the community from runoff coming from Mr. Harper's land." Every head in the room turned toward me. I didn't say anything. Victor Salazar stood up instead, because he was there too. The county had sent him as an observer, and when a county engineer stands up during an HOA meeting, people usually listen. Victor walked to the front, picked up the drainage plan from the table, and addressed the room calmly. The drainage pipe was not part of the approved system. The room went silent. Victor continued. "It was installed after inspection without a permit. A homeowner near the window spoke up, so the HOA added it?" Victor nodded. "Based on the evidence we've reviewed, yes." Someone else asked the question everyone was thinking. "Did that cause the flooding?" Victor took a moment before answering. The pipe redirected stormwater away from the designed drainage corridor. He pointed at the diagram. During heavy rainfall, the retention basin filled faster than the system could release water. He paused, and because the overflow channel had been blocked, he looked directly at Marlene. The water backed up. A man near the front row said quietly, "and flooded downhill." Victor nodded again. "Correct." Then he added the part that changed the tone of the entire meeting. "The county considers the modification a violation of the original stormwater permit." Marlene's face turned pale because everyone in that room understood what that meant. The HOA board had authorized an illegal modification to the drainage system, and that modification had damaged multiple properties, including mine. The turning point. Once the facts were on the table, the meeting shifted quickly. Homeowners started asking questions Marlene couldn't easily answer. Who approved the pipe? How much is this going to cost? Are we responsible for repairing Mr. Harper's property? Are we going to get fined? Marlene tried to steer the conversation. This situation is more complicated than it appears, but the momentum had changed. Victor answered several technical questions about the drainage system. Then Wendell stood up. "I'd like to propose something." He looked around the room. "Most of us bought homes here because we trusted the HOA board to manage the property responsibly." He paused. "But the board authorized a change that violated county regulations and caused significant damage." He looked at Marlene. "With respect, that's a leadership problem." The room went quiet again. Then someone clapped, just once. Then a few others joined. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. The vote under the Lake Ridge HOA bylaws. Homeowners could call for a vote of no confidence if 25% of the membership supported it. By the time Wendell finished speaking, far more than 25% had raised their hands. The vote happened 10 minutes later. Marlene stood rigidly at the front of the room while ballots were counted. 48 homeowners participated. 36 voted to remove her as HOA president. 9 voted against, 3 abstained. The board member beside her read the result aloud, and for the first time since I'd met her, Marlene Keaton didn't argue. She simply gathered her papers, walked out of the clubhouse, and drove away. Aftermath. The weeks that followed were surprisingly calm. The HOA hired an independent engineering firm to redesign the stormwater system. The unauthorized pipe was removed, the blocked drainage channel was restored, and the retention basins were expanded to handle future storms. The HOA also paid for the repairs to my pasture, new fencing, regraded soil, fresh grass seed across the flooded meadow. It cost them a little over $18,000, which compared to the potential regulatory fines was actually a bargain. 6 months later, Lake Ridge elected a new HOA president, a quiet software engineer named David Lynn. His campaign slogan was simple: less enforcement, more common sense. It worked. He won by a landslide. The dock is for the dock that started all of this? It's still there. Same cedar planks, same quiet view across the lake. The county confirmed what the deed had said all along. My shoreline rights were perfectly legal, and no HOA covenant could change that. These days, the Lake Ridge homeowners walk the path near the shoreline without much fuss. Some of them even stop by the dock to say hello. A few bring fishing rods. Sometimes we talk about boats, sometimes about weather, sometimes about how strange it is that a drainage pipe nearly started a neighborhood war. One last thing, if there's a lesson in the story, it isn't about revenge, it's about understanding the land you live on. Drainage patterns, property, rights, permits. Those things matter more than most people realize, because once water starts moving, it doesn't stop for HOA rules, it doesn't stop for fences, and it definitely doesn't stop for someone who thinks authority is the same thing as expertise. Land has its own logic, and if you ignore that logic long enough, eventually it reminds you who's really in charge. I learned that lesson from my grandfather a long time ago, standing on the edge of this same lake, watching the water move across the land. And if you ever find yourself in a dispute over property, remember something simple. Before you start telling someone what they can do with their land, make sure you understand the ground you're standing on, because sometimes the problem you create uphill is the one that comes back downhill.